Our phone cut out earlier, but we're back and we're going to jump in where we left off, talking about Yahushua Messiah establishing the kingdom of Elohim with his 12 and 70 after the pattern of Moses. And remember, we were talking about David after that first 14 generations of Josiah, that really the house of David was cut down to a stump. But we read it by the prophet Isaiah in chapter 11, verse 1, "And a rod shall come forth from the stump of Jesse, and a sprout from his roots shall bear fruit." Now, in some translations, instead of sprout, it says branch. And we've already read about in Zechariah chapter 6, where the man whose name is the branch, Yahusha, that he would build the Hekel, or the set-apart place of Yahuwah. And that's exactly what we see with the Messiah coming and establishing the kingdom of Elohim, according to not only the Zechariah 6, but Isaiah 9, 6, and 7. We see confirmation of this also in the book of Acts in chapter 15, in verse 13, where it's written, "And after they were silent, Jacob, who is James, answered, saying, 'Men, brothers, listen to me. Shimon,'" that's Peter, "has declared how Elohim first visited the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. And the words of the prophets agree with this. As it has been written, 'After this I shall return and rebuild the tabernacle of David, which has fallen down. And I shall rebuild its ruins, and I shall set it up, so that the remnant of mankind shall seek Yahuwah, even all the Gentiles on whom my name has been called,' says Yahuwah, who is doing all this, who has made this known from of old." And this is important to understand that James is quoting from the prophet Amos in chapter 9. So if you need to go back and check that out, go ahead and check it out. But interestingly enough, he says that the tabernacle of David has been lifted up so Gentiles could actually come in. And this is quite different than what we typically hear in replacement theology, because they teach that in Acts 2 that a new entity was created. And this is different than what we've seen throughout the whole entire Scripture. We see that Messiah came to renew the covenant with both houses of Israel, the northern house and Israel, and Yehuda, the southern house. That through the stake, he was going to bring them together as one. But not only was he going to restore Israel, the two houses, but he was also going to raise up the tabernacle of David. That's the leadership within Israel of the 12 tribes, so that the Gentiles could now come into this body. They could also become partakers and become citizens with the set-apart ones of Israel. And this is really quite different than what a lot of people have been taught. I'd like to read something from 2 Samuel 23, verse 3, where it's written, "And the Elohim of Israel said, 'The rock of Israel spoke to me. He that rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of Elohim.'" Now this is one of David's last words. And he tells us, his descendants, that he that rules over men must be just. Now this is fascinating because Zedek, the righteous one, Melchizedek, as we've already talked about, this is a picture that David's saying that his seed, the one that rules, must be just. And it's interesting because Messiah's caregiver, Joseph, it says he was a just man, or a righteous in some translation. But it's fascinating that not only was Joseph a just, but James is called James the Just. And this may be more of a title than a lot of people understand, referring back to those who have the right to rule. And that's exactly what we see in the first century, that James was lifted up, ruling over the congregation. He was this Davidic leader that we see back in Jeremiah 33, verses 23 through 26, that as we remember reading, it says that David's descendants would be rulers over the house of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That there would be always descendants from David that will be in these leadership roles. We've already talked about Daniel and Zerubbabel, but we also see, it says Joseph was just, James the just, and we also see, even in, ironically, even in Christian history by Eusebius, he mentions 15 Hebrew leaders that after Messiah's Aliyah, that James and 14 other Hebrew leaders were present in the early congregation. We are not taught too much about this. A lot of people have been taught that this Gentile thing started in Acts 2 and just went off from there. But the reality of the matter is that Yah's plan from the beginning, using these sons of David, not only for the king, but for rulership and leadership in Israel, has not gone away. That will always be leadership from the house of David. And that's what I want to kind of bring out here a little bit, because after James was martyred, we have the second individual in line was Simeon. Now, I want to give a little bit of background here. I'll put some references below so you can double check what I'm saying. And this is some additional history, but I think it's good to understand because we're not taught this. We're not taught that the early assembly, the leadership was a Hebrew and even connected to this whole Davidic thing we've been talking about. And Simeon is believed to be the son of Clopas. Now, on the road to Emmaus, we can read this in Luke 24, when these two were on the road to Emmaus, believing that, hoping the Messiah was raising, and it was the third day, and so Messiah appears to these two. Now, this is the interesting point. Joseph was Clopas' brother, so this makes Clopas a descendant of David. Well, Clopas' son Simeon was also believed to be on the road to Emmaus. Now, what's interesting in this Simeon, the one that was on the road to Emmaus, was the one who took the leadership role after James had been martyred. And it seems like this was already something decided ahead of time, but nevertheless, he took that leadership role. And it was under his leadership that when, let me back up just for a second, Messiah gave a prophecy that when you see the city of Jerusalem surrounded by an army, that you need to take flight and leave. And that seems kind of weird that you would wait for an army to surround the city, then know to flee to the mountains. But Josephus even records this, that Celsus, his army, came and surrounded the city and for no apparent reason got up and left. Well, at that time, Simeon was the leader of the early assembly, and they knew that was the sign to get out of Jerusalem, and they fled to Pella. And I'll add these quotes from Eusebius below so you can check that out for yourself. But my point of saying is that there's a completely different history than what a lot of people have been taught about the assembly. It was around 318 CE that the Roman church, if you want to call it that, I guess that's fine, broke away from this Hebraic leadership that we see going throughout of the early congregation. And not only did they break away, they violently persecuted the house of David. They martyred a Simeon as well, and they would kill anyone that was keeping Sabbath, that was following the Torah. They violently rebelled against Yah's order, and this is a problem. This has been going on for a long time, and most of what we see in modern day Christianity is so different than Acts 2 and Acts 15. This early leadership that basically goes all the way back to the Genesis, all the way back to the Torah for proper order and leadership. And this is a major thing that a lot of people haven't fully wrapped their minds around, that we have been taught things that just don't line up with Scripture. And this break of Rome doing their own thing and rebelling against Yah's order and authority is a major problem. And at that time, around 318, the assembly, for the most part, had to go underground. And there was other groups as well, some that are familiar with the Waldensians and things like that later on. They didn't want to have nothing to do with Rome either. And a lot of these people were killed and hunted down. A lot of the Hebrew scriptures were actually burned as well. So there was a major persecution by the Church of Rome against this Hebraic assembly that had been there for a number of years in the early assembly, and everything had to go underground at that point. I will mention, even Eusebius mentions, when these early leaders, these Hebrew leaders, were leading the assembly, that at that time that the early congregation was pure. It was later on when false teachers crept in that they moved away from the righteous instructions. And it's no wonder, because when we look at the modern day Christianity, it's so perverted and so twisted, it looks nothing like Acts 15. It looks nothing like Acts 2, that early congregation. So this is a big thing to wrap your mind around, but it's huge to understand the Davidic order of things. And this will play a big role at the end of the age as well. And I want to mention that when I'm talking about Davidic leaders, I'm talking about believers that are Davidic, not rabbinic Judaism. I'm not saying submit to rabbinic Judaism or nothing like that. Matter of fact, that's the very group Messiah basically rejected. We're talking about people that put their faith in Yahushua Messiah and are keeping the commandments. He's going to raise up leaders from the house of David. And we also know he's raising up leaders from the different tribes as well. We see in Revelation that 144,000, 12,000 from the tribes are going to be instrumental in bringing about the restoration and that kingdom order at the end of the age. Now, when we continue, we're going to look a little bit closer at Messiah's mission and how this feeds into the good news of the kingdom. Till next time, shalom.